I am very happy to be here today. I'm not here, my brothers and sisters, to entertain you or to tickle your ears. I do have a very serious message. As a matter of fact, at the request of the president of this university, I desire to discuss with you a matter which I think is of the utmost importance. This matter has been of deep concern to me and my associates for some time. I hope I'll not be misunderstood. I hope the counsel given will be received in the spirit in which it is given to you. Be assured, I feel that this matter is of the utmost concern to all of us. In the book of Kings, we read about a woman who came weeping to Elijah the prophet. Her husband had died and she owed a debt that she could not pay. And the creditor was on his way to take her 2 sons and sell them as slaves. By a miracle, Elisha enabled her to acquire a goodly supply of oil. And he said to her, "Go sell the oil and pay thy debt and live, thou and thy children of the rest." Pay thy debt and live. How fruitful these words have ever been. What wise counsel they are for us today. Read the words of wise men down through the ages, and we find over and over again this great insistence upon the wisdom of being debt-free. Shakespeare put on the lips of one of his characters in Hamlet these words: "Neither a borrower nor a lender be, for a loan oft loses both itself and friend, and borrowing dulls the edge of husbandry." And one of the wisest men in the annals of our country, Benjamin Franklin, wrote, "Think what you do when you run into debt. You give to another power over your liberty." Of course, times have changed since Franklin's day, but the principles of truth and wisdom never change. Our inspired church leaders have always urged Latter-day Saints to get out of debt, live within our means, and pay as we go. Our own pioneer forefathers have left us a heritage of thrift, of saving, of freedom from debt. Surely they would counsel us today in similar vein. I speak to you today of a twofold duty which all of us have: a duty to our country as Americans, as citizens, and a duty to ourselves as individuals, as children of God. Never has a nation been blessed with productivity as has this land. In 1961, our output of goods and services based on an inadequate index reached the enormous value of $522 billion. For 1962, it is projected at $570 billion based on an estimate of the president. There was an increase in terms of real value of almost 50% in the last 10 years. The increase in output for each person since 1946 has been nearly 50%. Whence comes this astounding capacity to produce? I am deeply convinced that it lies in the blessings of our Heavenly Father and in the untrammeled initiative, enterprise, and freedom of our people. Yet despite our wealth, our productivity, our material progress, do we not see signs of danger ahead? Do we not discern unhealthy tendencies, perhaps even germs of decay, in a general weakening of some of our oldest American traditions? We must ever remember that nations often sow the seeds of their own destruction while enjoying unprecedented prosperity. In the past quarter century, there has been a tremendous shift from individual to governmental responsibility in many phases of economic and social life. There has been a rapid shift of responsibility from the states to the federal government. In the last 30 years, state and local government taxes have increased 550%, while the federal government taxes have increased 3,275%. 30 years ago, all taxes, federal, state, and local, took 14% of our national income. Today, taxes take over 33%. In 28 years, the national debt has swollen to nearly $300 billion, an average in excess of $7,000 for each family. Today, interest on the national debt is near $10 billion a year, 8 times as great as the entire federal indebtedness back in 1915. Meantime, our people have come to look to the federal government as the provider, at no cost to them, of whatever is needful. If this trend continues, the states may be left hollow shells, operating primarily as the field districts of the federal departments and depending upon the federal treasury for their support. Through a great effort, we reduced the national debt by $4 billion back in 1956. There has been no debt reduction since. In the 1962 State of the Union message, there was not a word from the President about reducing the public debt. In fiscal 1961, we are showing a deficit of over $7 billion in spite of unprecedented prosperity. The fiscal authorities estimate that the 1963 so-called balanced budget will end up with a deficit of several billion dollars, largely because of advance commitments. If the budget is to be in balance, why did the President in his budget message request a $10 billion increase in the debt limit? This, to me, is an admission of fiscal irresponsibility, which speaks louder than lip service to budget balancing. The course of spending and debt and inflation, followed by more spending and more debt and more inflation, has become a deeply rutted road. This but illustrates how much easier it is to go into debt than to get out. With a loss of gold and a weakened competitive position for world markets, this deficit spending, the major cause of inflation, is a serious threat which, if it is not stopped, could give atheistic communism victory without firing a single shot. History teaches that when individuals have given up looking after their own economic needs and transferred a large share of that responsibility to the government, both they and the government have failed. At least 20 great civilizations have disappeared. The pattern is shockingly similar. All, before their collapse, showed a decline in spiritual values, in moral stamina, and in the freedom and responsibility of their citizens. They showed such symptoms as deficit spending, excessive taxation, bloated bureaucracy, government paternalism, and generally a rather elaborate set of supports, controls, and regulations affecting prices, wages, production, and consumption. According to Maurice Stans, prominent West Coast banker and columnist and former budget director, experience shows that no nation, not even the strongest in the world, can continue to pile up huge deficits without risking inflation, a loss of integrity in its money, an international collapse of confidence in that nation's soundness, and worse. The end of such a course is national bankruptcy. Stans further states that in addition to direct debt, the government has piled up huge unfunded liabilities and commitments for future spending that total more than the debt itself. 2 years ago, as budget director, he compiled a list of these obligations maturing in the future, mostly for past services, and it came to about $450 billion. Added to the current debt of close to $300 billion, our total commitments now reach the almost incredible total of $750 billion, or $750 billion. And even this stratospheric amount doesn't include another $250 to $300 billion we will need to collect in future tax increases to make good on our present promises under the Social Security system. In the 30 fiscal years Since 1931, the federal budget has shown a surplus only 6 times, while we went in the red 24 times. And the national debt grew and grew, even in years of peace. Government costs are booming because not enough people have been willing to say no to government. On the other hand, spending pressure groups of all kinds have been steadily and successfully entreating Congress to provide a wide assortment of aids and handouts. The public has been offered more public services than it needs and has accepted them without reckoning the costs. Thomas Jefferson, while President of the United States, expressed what I hope and pray is the conviction of all of us. Mark carefully his wise declaration. I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against any form of tyranny over the minds and lives of men. To preserve our independence, we must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt. We must take our choice between economy and liberty, or profusion and servitude. If we run into such debts, we must be taxed in our meat and drink, in our necessities and in our comforts, in our labors and in our amusements. If we can prevent the government from wasting the labor of the people under the pretense of caring for them, they will be happy, unquote. That government is best which governs least, so taught the courageous founders of this nation. This simple declaration is diametrically opposed to the all too common philosophy that the government should protect and support one from the cradle to the grave. The policy of the founding fathers has made our people and our nation strong. The opposite philosophy leads inevitably to moral decay. Now, I do not say that all debt is bad. Of course not. Sound business debt and reasonable debt for education is one of the elements of growth. Sound mortgage credit is a real help to a family that must borrow for a home. But is it not apparent that in the areas of both public and personal debt, the limitations of soundness have been seriously strained? Like government debt, personal debt has sharply increased, reaching a total of $54.8 billion at the end of this year, compared with only $9 billion 20 years ago. Consumer debt has increased tenfold in 15 years. The use of consumer credit predominates in the purchase of durable goods. Furniture stores reported that 63% of total sales were made on an installment basis, 19% on charge accounts, and 18% for cash. Similar situations occur for the sales of television sets, cars, and even some non-durable consumer goods. There are many ways in which the consumer is lured into the purchase of goods by installment credit, by misleading advertising and sales approaches. Once these consumers have committed themselves to a contract, there are many ways in which the effective rate of interest is increased. As Fortune magazine says, the buying public hardly thinks about the cost of money at all. I have here today 3 rather typical cases. In the interest of time, I'm not going to mention the first one, although it is important. Maybe you'll read it. It has to do with automobile financing. Easy auto credit returns. Case number 2 has to do with hidden clauses. At times, an obscure clause in the contract you sign obligates you to buy something which you do not want and cannot possibly use. An example from the American Legion magazine will make clear what is meant. John and his wife needed a new refrigerator. John knew they needed it, but felt that they couldn't afford it until they had paid off on the car and a couple of other things. One Thursday evening, wifey inveigled John into an appliance store just to look. The companion of his joys and sorrows was just showing John one of the new blank refrigerators, and he was saying that it was swell, but they still couldn't afford it, when temptation reared its ugly head. Temptation took the form of a smooth-talking, high-pressure salesman with a quarter-a-day meter in his hand. He explained that they could have one of these fine new super deluxe blank refrigerators for just 25 cents a day. The refrigerator would be delivered with the meter attached, and all they had to do would be to drop a daily 2 bits into the slot in the meter. Simple. The refrigerator would run as long as the meter was fed, and a man would come around and empty the meter every month until the appliance was paid for. So John fell. After all, a quarter a day doesn't sound like much. A quarter a day is over $7 a month. $7 they were very definitely not going to have to spare. But the things that the salesman didn't tell them, it was in the fine type clause in the contract. The thing that really burned John to a crisp when he found out about it was the fact that along with the refrigerator, they were also buying the meter. $20 it cost them, about twice what it was actually worth. They didn't have to have a refrigerator, but the meter was absolutely useless after it had served its purpose. Another case. A government committee in Massachusetts investigating installment selling practices checked on so-called 6% rates. In 105 cases in which 6% interest was quoted, the rates actually were as follows. 1 case, 6%. 6 cases, actually between 7 and 10%. 61 cases, between 11 and 20%. 19 cases, between 21 and 30%. 10 cases, between 31 and 100%. And 8 cases between 101 and 679%. Most automobile purchasers, a state legislative committee in Wisconsin found, thought they were paying between 8 and 12% for credit. The real rates, the committee estimated, were between 17 and 40%, and in many transactions even higher. I cannot condemn too vigorously the purchase by students of automobiles on credit. This is not a popular statement with some, I'm sure. I am informed that each year we here at BYU have more students discontinue school because they can't keep up the payments on their automobiles than for any other reason. The fact of the matter is, according to your own president, at BYU with its rich cultural and recreational on-the-campus program, students do not need an automobile. Furthermore, church activities are also centered right on the campus. Of course, credit is a willing servant but a cruel master. There is the story of the argument between the pedestrian and the motorist. "You act as if you owned the road," shouted the motorist. "And you drive as if you owned the car," responded the pedestrian. If the motorist did indeed own the car, free of debt, he was in the minority. No matter which income group we select, the proportion of people with such debt has increased since 1949. A few years ago, only 1 family out of 3 owed personal debts. Now more than half have such obligations. Why this great increase in debt today? Have incomes declined so that people must borrow money to maintain their level of living? No. Incomes generally have shown a steady climb to the present record level. Is there something about the distribution of income which explains this increase in debt? No, strangely enough, personal debt is reported most frequently not for the low, but for the middle income brackets. These families with incomes of $4,000 to $7,500 annually. Fortune magazine summed it up this way: the young people who someday will run our capitalist economy, how do they run their own? atrociously. They are so bemused with the rhythm of equal monthly payments, they hardly think about the cost of money at all. How can we explain the increase in private debt? One reason, I believe, is that the adult experience of many people covers only the period of the war and post-war inflationary period, the years of high employment and high income since the early 40s. During these years, those who went in debt to buy a home or a farm saw the value of their equity increase. Those who bought cars or home utilities experienced relatively little difficulty in paying for them. Wages and prices rose. Incomes increased. The longer one postponed a purchase, the more he had to pay. For many of these people, it is difficult to believe that a serious recession will ever come again. Feeling secure in their expectations of continuing employment and a steady flow of wages and salaries, they obligate their future income without thought of what they would do if they should lose their jobs or their incomes were stopped for some other reason. But the best authorities in America have repeatedly said that we are not yet smart enough to control our economy without downward adjustments. Sooner or later, these adjustments will come. Another reason for this increase in debt, I believe, is deeper and causes greater concern. This is the rise of materialism as contrasted with spiritual values. Many a family, in order to make a proper showing, will commit itself for a larger and more expensive home than is needed in an expensive neighborhood. Again, almost everyone would, it seems, like to keep up with the Joneses. With the increasing standard of living, the temptation increases with each new gadget that comes on the market. The subtle and carefully planned techniques of modern advertising are aimed at the weakest points of consumer resistance. And there is a growing feeling, unfortunately, that material things should be had now without waiting, without saving, without self-denial. How many people stop to think when they buy on a 36 months to pay basis that they place their future earnings for 3 years ahead in the hands of moneylenders? What is there about a late model car that could make such a sacrifice worthwhile? Worse still, a large proportion of families with personal debt have no liquid assets whatever to fall back upon. What troubles they invite if their income should be suddenly cut off or seriously reduced? We all know of families who have obligated themselves far more than they could pay. There is a world of heartache behind such cases, and if time permitted, we could recount many of them. All of us Americans have a patriotic responsibility not to contribute to the inflation danger by needlessly building still higher the mountain of total debt. All of us as individuals, and above all as members of families, have an obligation in conscience not to mismanage our resources. It is not fair to ourselves or our communities to be so improvident in our spending that the day our income stops, we must turn to relief agencies or the church for financial aid. Do not, I solemnly urge you, tie yourselves to the payment of carrying charges that are often exorbitant. Save now and buy later, and you will be much further ahead. Save now and buy later. You will spare yourselves high interest and other payments, and the money you save may provide opportunity for you to buy later at substantial cash discounts. If you must incur debt to meet reasonable necessities of life, such as buying a house and furniture, then I implore you, as you value your solvency and happiness, buy within your means. So use credit wisely to acquire an education, a farm, to own a home, but resist the temptation to plunge into a property far more pretentious or spacious than you really need. How much better how much better off you will be, especially young families just starting out, if first you buy a small house, which you can expect to pay for in a relatively short time. Such a house in a neighborhood where values are increasing will usually provide the basis for a very large down payment on a bigger home when you are ready for it. Do not leave yourself or your family unprotected against financial storms. Forego luxuries, for the time being at least, to build up savings. How wise it is to provide for the future education of children and for old age. The smaller the family income, the more important it is that every dollar be used wisely. Efficient spending and saving will give the family more security, more opportunities, more education, and a higher standard of living. As I look back on the establishment of my own home, I'm grateful for a companion who, although accustomed to many of the luxuries of life, was willing to start humbly. Vividly, I recall her doing the washing by hand until we could afford to buy a second-hand washer. There was no overstuffed furniture. There was no carpeting on the floors. As a graduate student on a $70 a month scholarship, I recall entertaining at dinner at the head of the department at the college. We sat down at a card table, which was not used for cards, because there was no dining table. We gathered vegetables from the college experimental farm, from the plots to cut down on the grocery bill and live within our means. The president of this university and his wife and many others have had similar experiences in a determination to make ends meet. Now, when personal incomes nationally are at the highest level in history, is the time to pay off obligations. I doubt that there will be soon again, if ever, a more favorable time for Latter-day Saints generally to get out of debt than now. Let us use the opportunity we have to speed up repayments of mortgages and to set aside provision for education, possibly periods of decreased earning power and emergencies the future may hold. What can we do to prepare for what may lie ahead? Answers to this question have been repeated to our people many times over the years. Here are some of them. First, get out of debt and live within your means. Second, save what you can from your income. Third, store at least 1 year's supply of food, clothing, and other household necessities. 4, pay your tithes and offerings. 5, support the welfare plan. Joseph F. Smith, giving advice to the young men of the church in 1900, 1 year before he became president, said this: "It is better to live simply, dress plainly, be sparing in your indulgence, even if it is harmless, than to replenish your purse for luxuries by going into debt. Let this rather be done by lessening your desires and by curtailing your needs. We have come to think that there is only one way to change the course of events if your expenses are greater than your income. But there is another way to make ends meet which does not seem to have been seriously or often considered. It is to cut expenses, lessen desires, curtail needs, and without being penurious, compel them to come as far as desirable within the line of one's income, small though it be." President Heber J. Grant often spoke against going into debt. On one occasion he observed, "If there is one thing that will bring peace and contentment into the human heart and into the family, it is to live within your means. And if there is any one thing that is grinding and discouraging and disheartening, it is to have debts and obligations that one cannot meet." Speaking in General Conference in April 1938, President J. Reuben Clark, Jr. warned of the burden of interest, installment buying, and long-time debts. He said, In my view, no home is too good, no comfort too great, no luxury too rich for the humblest family that can afford them. But for the least essential comforts and for all the luxuries, let me urge you to pay as you go. Let us never forget that today we are in the biggest battle ever staged. Our opponent is socialism, the welfare state, and the penalty of failure is enslavement. We must keep strong spiritually, morally, and economically, as individuals, families, communities, and as a nation. Only in this course is safety. Stewardship, not conspicuous consumption, is the proper relationship of man to material wealth. Again, I say there may never be a more favorable time than now for most people to get their financial house in order so far as debt is concerned. Yes, let us live within our income. Let us pay as we go. Let us pay thy debt and live. Let us heed the counsel of the leadership of the church. Get out of debt. Let us pay first our obligations to our Heavenly Father. Then we will more easily pay our debts to our fellow men. Let us heed the counsel of President Brigham Young, who said, "Pay your debts. Do not run into debt anymore. Be prompt in everything, and especially to pay your debts." And again, President Smith, in the time of prosperity, get out of debt. If you desire to prosper and to be a free people, first meet your obligations to God and then to your fellow men. And again, President Grant, tithing is the law of God. Be honest with the Lord, and I promise them, the Latter-day Saints, that peace, prosperity, and financial success will attend. Let me warn the Latter-day Saints to buy automobiles and the luxuries of life when they have the money to buy them, and not to mortgage their future. There is a peace and a contentment which comes into the heart when we live within our means. God grant us the wisdom and the faith to heed the inspired counsel of the priesthood, to get out of debt, to live within our means, and to pay as we go. In short, to pay thy debt and live, I humbly pray in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.